Biden really had hung on for this long. I thought maybe he's actually going to see the race through to the election in November. There was, however, just so much pressure by Democratic lawmakers, by donors, by members of the media, by what were in the past allies of Biden, encouraging him to get out of the race. And I think that that pressure essentially just became overwhelming. Biden was essentially fighting two wars at one time, one against the Republican Party and Donald Trump, and one against his own party, the Democrats. And his candidacy ultimately just wasn't salvageable in that context. Although it wasn't just the Obamas, it was a number of high-ranking officials within the Democratic Party, including Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer, Adam Schiff, Hakeem Jeffries, and so on. All of them had either publicly or privately made it clear to Biden that they think that he should have dropped out. Trump just had all the momentum. It's hard to look at the polls and not be dispirited if you're a Democrat. Trump seemed to be ahead in most of the polls before the assassination attempt. And then that event, combined with the Republican National Convention, really supercharged his position in the polls. And next thing you knew, there were a number of different states, swing states, where Trump was up 5, 6, 7 percentage points, which is outside of the margin of error. There were even some states like Minnesota where Republicans were saying this might be in play, when in the past it had not. So I think it's absolutely the case that Biden took into consideration the polls whenever he made his decision. I think if it was just Democratic lawmakers and elites, he would have hung on. J.D. Vance, Trump's vice presidential pick, has actually said this over and over, that if Biden isn't cognitively fit to run for office, how is he cognitively fit to run the country for the next 4 or 5 months until the inauguration? I think what Biden would respond is that, there are many reasons why he chose to leave the race. He's ready to pass the torch. It's also the case that 4 months, Biden may be able to fulfill his duties, but thinking ahead 4 years, that's a different question. But this is going to be a line of attack the Republicans are going to make in the coming weeks. You may even hear some discussion of the 25th Amendment regarding sort of pushing a president out. I don't think that that will lead anywhere. But at the same time, it's an important talking point for the GOP. What seems to me like the convention in August is going to be more of a coronation than anything. Given that Biden explicitly endorsed Harris, and given that so many other what would have been potential replacements have also gotten behind Harris, I think it's really hard to see a different candidate challenge her in a legitimate way. There is some discussion that Joe Manchin, who's a moderate senator from West Virginia, could throw his hat into the ring. I still think that's unlikely. So the Democrats will try to give off the perception that there's a transparent, open process that's unfolding in the next several weeks. But in reality, I think that it's all designed simply to ensure that Kamala Harris becomes the nominee and emerges from that process with strength. Of course, one of the big challenges or concerns by Democrats to this point is that this would generate a huge amount of chaos and disorder, and that they would look in even more disarray than they were. I think by coalescing behind Kamala Harris, they can largely avoid that problem. I am not convinced that Kamala Harris is significantly more electable than Joe Biden against Donald Trump. Yes, Joe Biden's numbers didn't look very good, but I think that the media and some other elites are convincing themselves all of a sudden that Harris is much more popular than she is. During the entirety of the Biden administration, she has had poll numbers that were below Biden's. Her numbers look maybe slightly better against Trump in a head-to-head matchup, but not much. And certainly there's some polling showing that she is not going to do as well against Donald Trump. I will say that I think her numbers are maybe more malleable than Biden's were. So that could go to the upside or to the downside. Americans are familiar with Kamala Harris, but for the first 3 years or so of the Biden presidency, she was largely relegated to a portfolio of relatively low priority issues. Recently, she's gained the spotlight more by covering the abortion issue in the wake of the Dobbs decision. And that has been a message that has resonated with voters. But I think during the convention, also, if there is a debate, she's going to have an opportunity to make somewhat of a second first impression, so to speak. And if she misses that opportunity, I think it's going to be difficult for her to recover simply because there's such a short window between now and the election. I think all else equal, the Trump campaign would rather have squared off against Biden than Harris. Harris just injects more uncertainty into the election. I don't necessarily think that Trump's momentum and advantage is going to be stunted, at least in the short term, simply because we all know that the Make America Great Again base is absolutely 100% behind him. I do think, though, that among Democrats, this could rejuvenate some of the base. The progressives may be more excited about coming out for Kamala Harris. It's also the case that she may be more likely to win over so-called double haters, those who dislike both Trump and Biden. And that's important because there was a lot of concern that those voters wouldn't necessarily shift to Trump in the end, but that they wouldn't show up at all. They disliked Trump a lot, but they didn't like Biden so much that they would actually show up to the polls. So I think many Congress members were worried about that because they thought it could have an effect down ballot on Senate races, on House races, on governor races. How tightly does Harris bind herself to the last 4 years of the Biden administration? She's certainly going to take credit for the perceived successes, but it's unclear to me whether she's going to distance herself from other aspects of the Biden presidency. I don't expect a whole lot of daylight between her policies relative to Biden. I think she's going to advocate for significant levels of social spending. I think she's going to largely be supportive of sending funding for Ukraine. I think she's going to latch on to sort of this general message of protecting democracy at home and ensuring that the United States plays an active, vigorous role in promoting democracy abroad. I think there's certainly a number of different names that have been floated. If I had to just single out one, it would be Joshua Shapiro, who is the governor of Pennsylvania. I may be partial simply because I'm from Pennsylvania originally. Shapiro really balances out the ticket well for Kamala Harris. Most importantly, he's from Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania has 20 electoral votes, and that could make a big difference in this campaign. Even if Trump wins Pennsylvania, he'll have to spend a lot more resources in order to do it, and that will siphon off resources from other states. I'm always reluctant to make predictions. I do think that it's essentially a coin flip at this point. If you look at the polls, I think it's roughly 50-50. I will say that one thing that I don't think is being accounted for sufficiently is the role that a third-party candidate can make in this election. I don't think that a third-party candidate could actually win, but if a third-party candidate takes 3, 4, 5 percentage points of the vote in some of these key swing states, and Robert F. Kennedy Jr. right now looks like he's poised to be able to do that, I think it could change the dynamics of the race fairly significantly. So I think it's maybe somewhat misleading simply to look at head-to-head matchups between Trump and Harris without accounting for these third parties. The election is going to be close. It's going to be absolutely close. And so any difference sort of here or there by third parties could make a real difference.